I feel like shit. I feel like I got the cold sweats. Seems like either I got some kind of fucking flu or it's a caffeine withdrawal. Feel pressure in my head. Anxiety. Pain, suffering, a lack of desire for anything in this world. It's interesting how, much of what we end up wanting in this world is like, it doesn't come from a genuine spark within us, it just comes from like ideas, images, created by the media, created by the people that we're exposed to. We're all sort of like shoved through this extruder of the education system. And, so much time and energy gets put into that. And sort of like strips away a natural connection to self, the actual self that isn't all this hypothetical, jargon that we're supposed to like conceptualize and deem it as important because of the arm twisting and the coercive nature of, what they call being socialized, but it's not like, none of it really comes from love or a presence, being present with the real needs of children, It comes from this idea of fear that if we don't, put these children through this cheese grater, then, something, they'll turn into losers. So it's almost as if, that there's this pervasive idea in this world that being natural is a loser, that being connected to what you really feel that is genuine and comes from within and being connected to life from a first person perspective, but somehow that is a dangerous thing to do, that we should ignore all of our instincts, all our feelings, and instead we should listen to people who don't really have any emotional attachment to us, people who speak to us in condescending and indifferent voices, and the only thing that they want, and the only thing that is motivating all of it, is fear, it's like, how are you supposed to find any desire for, what you're told to desire if the method of teaching what is good and what one should achieve in this world is, it's based on fear, fear on if we don't do this, then some horrible outcome will happen. And so, it's like this, I feel like this tension within myself. And, it's sort of like, how some people describe, like one of their regrets when they're in an abusive relationship, with someone is that, all the time that was wasted, they could have been happier on their own, doing their own thing, figuring out what it is that they want, and just not, just to not be stressed by somebody who's like adversarial and, makes life difficult. That's sort of like what it's like, I think, to live in a world, where the enemy is like programmed into us, and it's like we're taught to feel that what we naturally feel an inclination towards, and when our instincts, sort of disagree with what is being, what we're pressured, to participate in, sorry, lost my train of thought, but it's interesting, it's like we're essentially taught to not have boundaries, as children, like people walk all over the natural inclinations of children, and, then we end up in a world, where we have to, it's like later on, it's like, oh, you gotta like do all this psychological work. It's like to undo all the fucking misery that has been implanted into you, all this counterproductive, fear-based, anxiety-driven railroad to a place where, nobody is really happy, and no one, nothing is really waiting for us there, except when we get there, we are like left with all the years and years of not listening to what comes from within. And then, it's like, oh, we've achieved it, but why do I feel so empty inside? Why do I feel like I can't connect with the people in my life? Why do I feel so disconnected? And it's like, well, yeah, it's because like what the world has done to us is for, to ignore what is really, the beautiful, the source of beauty within us, the source of love within us. The true inspiration within us. And it's, all based on this anxiety driven about, if I don't do this, then people will think that I'm not successful, It's like, who gives a fuck about success, It's like, who cares about what title you have next to your name if you're fucking miserable, If you're like a fucking sleepwalking through your life and you're just not in touch with who it is that you really are, with the more, it's like the more real part of yourself, it's like that's not encouraged, and that's not, that's viewed with fear, it's like, it's like people take a lot of pride in like having overcome their, their natural instincts. They sort of like, it's like we're all like accused of being like savages or something. Well, I'd rather be, a savage that is connected to who and what it is that I really am than some fucking empty shell filled with nerves and anxiety, because the self that I fed my entire life is some abstract notion of trying to please people who never really cared about my quality of life to begin with, who all sort of conspired to reinforce their own sense of self-worth, that all people, it's like that the more people that they can convince that their disconnected way of doing things, they're lacking in love, somehow leads to something good, It's like the more people they can convince of that, the more they feel safe and validated. And if someone is not swallowing that, then they like, everyone like gathers together, and it's like, we're going to have an intervention with this person. We got to let them know how fucked up they are, because they need to get back in line, They're problematic. They're not predictable in the way that we want. Why does this child not listen or care about what we care about? Why does he not see the importance of all our wheels spinning and directionless aimlessness? Isn't it important that we have good, working people that just, build our things? Don't we need all these different people to fill these different roles? Isn't that important? Isn't it important to fit into society? To have some place? I don't think it is. I don't think it is at all. I think you're better off as a homeless person in the streets. If you're more connected, if you find more connection within yourself, if you're more, if that is where you feel the truth of yourself, more where you feel the freedom of being in touch with who it is that you are, and you're not feeling like you're constantly having to compromise with what is right within yourself and some, voice that's been implanted in you from other people who are, who don't really know anything, It's like, sure, it's like they know what they know, and they're, it's like everyone's the specialist, of what they've learned. But do they know how to be happy with who they are? I think a lot of people in this Western society don't. And they don't, it's like, it's amazing how that is not a value, to most people, Being connected to who you are first, and then, going off into the world and making your decisions based on that, of what works for you, and not what other people try to instill in you with fear. Like, that is not encouraged. It's like we're encouraged to live in this anxious, fearful state in order to achieve, some type of usefulness for some external source of, like we get a little pat on the back from. But, the truth is there's no real satisfaction in that, because it takes us away from a sense of wholeness, a sense of connectedness, of the true source of, happiness. It comes from having an awareness of what is going on within our inner world. So anyhow, I'll leave it here. Have a good one.